Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, part 2 in our series about forging a hunter in the vague style of a Randall hunting knife. In the first part of the video, we forged, ground, and heat treated the blade. Then we laboriously fit the guard to the knife. Now we'll begin working on the handle. I'll be using a matched pair of curly cherry scales cut from a larger blank. You can buy pre-made scales, but I find it's a lot cheaper to buy big hunks of high quality wood and then hack them up yourself. That does involve some labor though. The key point in making scales is that the wood needs to be extremely flat on the mating surfaces. I'll be using a disc grinder to flatten them out. Of course, you could do this by hand with sandpaper. Whatever you use though, I always like to grind oversized because no matter what kind of flattening method you use, there's invariably some rolling of the edges. That extra material will be trimmed off later and you'll have a nice clean fit. I'm checking against a light source here to see if the scales are mating properly. Now there are plenty of other ways to make a handle like this. Burning the tang in, three-piece construction, drilling it out, you name it. But I'm borrowing a technique from Japanese sword making, using a two-piece tang that I'll hollow out by hand with a chisel. Could you use a router? Sure. The thing I always say about routers though is that unless you have a standard router jig set up for this exact kind of job, building a jig takes longer than chiseling it by hand. Again, this is one of these try-fit kind of things where you chisel a little bit, try-fit it, chisel some more until you get everything fit about right. When I'm fitting them, I'm going to leave a little gap at the top here between the ricasso and the top of the wood, and that's going to be filled by the top face of the guard. Once the pieces are mated, I'll glue them with Titebond 3 wood glue. Note that I'm leaving the blade inside the handle for a while so that the glue doesn't creep and the wood doesn't shift around. If that happens, the tang won't fit and then you're in trouble. Bear in mind that if you leave it too long though, and you put a lot of glue in there, you may end up gluing the tang inside prematurely. So once the glue seems to have set up just a little bit, I'll usually pop the knife out again. Hey guys, let me jump in and make a quick pitch to ask for your support for this channel. Easy to do. Jump over to Patreon, there's a link in the description and the cards, and show the love. Why bother? Well, just as a for instance, this particular video took about 40 hours to make, maybe more. That's 40 hours that I had to bust loose from the time that I spend, putting food on my family's table. Now this video is obviously a little more elaborate than some I do, but still. So, putting aside that warm fuzzy feeling that it'll give you to help out the channel, you'll also get access to plans for many of the projects that I do, this one included. Alright, thanks for listening. And let's get back to making knives. So now it's time to shape the handle. I'll need to make a little shelf or boss or whatever you want to call it that will fit up inside the guard. The initial work on this can be pretty crude, so I'll just use a belt grinder to clear off some of the initial wood. Don't want to go too crazy though, because ultimately you want a nice tight joint. In fact, I want that joint between the guard and the wood to be as tight as humanly possible, so I'll eventually turn to this little carving knife to slowly square everything up. You obviously will never get a wood joint quite as tight as the guard to blade fit that we did earlier, but you do want it to be as good as possible. Now, while I'm whining and complaining about all this self-imposed anguish that I'm putting myself through on this project, let me amplify something that I alluded to earlier. If I'd made this guard from brass, I could do the final shaping of the guard and the handle wood at exactly the same time. Damascus, on the other hand, has to be etched. Can you etch it while it's on the final knife? No, you cannot. You'd get acid all over the blade. It would wick into the joint, might even get into the wood. Basically, it would wreck the knife. So that means you have to etch the Damascus before you assemble the handle. Once it's etched, the least little scratch or whatever will scrap it. So that means that all the woodwork has to be done, and done perfectly, before you ever assemble the knife. In particular, that means that you have to do the final guard to handle fit up without screwing up the guard in any way. And you have to do it all with no glue inside there or anything. So it's a very tricky little process. But it's basically the same idea here, just sneaking up on the fit using tiny little pieces of sandpaper. Once again, if you overshoot and you sand away more than, say, a few thousandths of an inch of wood, which is not much in wood world, then you'll have to reshape your guard to match the screw up. Now, of course, I did etch the guard originally for the previous video, but inevitably it got little scratches on it and so forth, so I knew I was going to have to repolish and re-etch it. Like I said earlier, I wouldn't have etched it before all the fit-up work if I hadn't been making a separate video about the guard. Anyway, once I got it all fitted up and got the woodwork done, I still wasn't happy with the fit-up of the guard. So I stoned, I don't know, maybe half a thousandth of an inch, a thousandth of an inch off of one side of the guard to get it to do exactly what I wanted and really tighten up that little gap. Once that was over, I repolished, buffed, and re-etched the guard in a highly dilute solution of ferric chloride. Now, one last piece of fiddling before fit up. I'm going to grind the final surface on the bevels and then give a last polish to the flats. Bear in mind that I've already completed fit up of the guard, so if I get all slap happy trying to perfect the finish and I take off a bunch of material on the blade, then I'll open up a visible gap between the blade and the guard, and those 5 hours of filing and fussing would be completely wasted. So I do just enough with 600 grit sandpaper to make the finish nice and clean, then I quit. I'll now drill a hole to fit a cross pin through the handle. So here's the final assembly. Last, I'll add a polyurethane finish. I never use hard finishes like polyurethane on knife handles, except here. The reason is that you can only use a hard finish like lacquer or poly if you're not doing any final finishing or adjustment of parts on the knife. At all, not one bit. Like I say, normally I don't make knives this way. Full tang knives, for instance, you just can't do it because the transition from tang to wood doesn't allow you to put hard finishes on. But in this case, because the guard's Damascus and once it's done and you can't touch it again, I can use a hard finish. The great thing about hard finishes like lacquer and polyurethane is they look fantastic, especially on a nice piece of wood like this. Obviously, the problem is that once you start messing around with them, you end up with this problematic transition between the wood finish and the metal. Here you can't really see the transition, but you can barely feel it with your finger. So that's the compromise I'm making here. Okay, here's the final product. Hope you enjoyed the project. As usual, we're going to have plans for the project on my Patreon page. So all my Patreon subscribers, you can go there and get plans for the project and go home and make it yourself.